We did live in an area that, well, I guess it would be sort of like a Japanese ghetto. It was actually very close to the downtown area that they call the International District now. I had just turned 6 when Pearl Harbor was bombed.
You were too young to probably think about things like that.
I certainly didn't comprehend, the enormity of what was happening.
December 7th, I was invited to a youth group of Japanese kids, and I was with some Japanese that day.
Do you remember that day?
The day?
The Pearl Harbor?
I do I was driving by then. I had a driver's license. And I remember it was right after church. And there's Lake Washington in Seattle where there's areas where they feed the ducks. And we were down watching them feed the ducks, and I had the car radio on. That's when we heard about Pearl Harbor.
I remember my father was working with a water pump, and I heard it on the radio. It was just about 12 o'clock, and so I went to my father and I said, "Pop, they bombed Pearl Harbor and the war has begun." And he just dropped the wrench down on the floor and he came up so sad, It was hard because we had my brother and sister was still over there,
The only thing I really remember is I think we were supposed to go to Japanese school. I think that was the following Monday, right after Pearl Harbor, and they said there's no Japanese school.
My brother Tom, who was 14 at the time, was at the movie theaters. This was on a Sunday morning.
Afterwards, after the party broke up around 3 o'clock, he says, "Let's go to a movie." And here are big headlines like this: war. Well, when you're 15, you don't, we didn't know where Pearl Harbor was.
They stopped the film, he told us, and then all of a sudden at the bottom of the screen came this scroll saying, "All military personnel report to your bases now." So he thought, oh my goodness, something must have happened. And then when he got out into the lobby, he heard people saying, "Oh, Pearl Harbor has been bombed." And then some people started pointing at him saying, "Oh, there's a Jap, let's get him." And so he ran all the way home from the theater just terrified with thinking that people were going to beat him up or, something terrible was going to happen.
I remember we were on Broadway, which is the main street in Oakland, and this drunken sailor started cussing us out, and he says, "What's the matter with him?" And a soldier says, "Leave him alone. They had nothing to do with it, By the time I got home, it was dark, and my parents were out of their gourd, wondering what happened to me.
Once the evacuation started, what was the sequence of events?
Well, my parents had to sell most of just about all of his grocery. And eventually they ended up with a co-op, people coming in and buying up the whole supply of grocery that we had at $1/10 of the cost. And then my mother would say, "We're going to have steak dinner tonight because this is the last time we're going to have steak."
My father had just purchased a brand new Chrysler, and so he was so proud of that. But our lawyer, he purchased it for a minimal fee, and so he was really disappointed that he wasn't as trustworthy as we had hoped to be.
They used to post this up in Japantown that we had 1 week to get ready, and so we had to get rid of our things. And I mentioned my sister's bicycle. So sad, she had to sell that. She worked so hard for it. And then we had a piano, I remember that. And so we sold what we could, and then a lot of things we had to give away. But we had this wonderful friend, Mrs. Farmington. They owned a hotel, and my mother and father used to work for them at their home before, a long time ago. And so they were nice enough to store our trunk. And we didn't save many things. And then after the war, they sent it out to St. Paul for us.
Yeah, I think my father, even though he didn't speak about it very much later, in later life, I gather that he was of the opinion, or he shared the opinion of those who felt that the way that the Japanese Americans could show their patriotism and loyalty was to cooperate with the government and go into the camps at that point. Most of the people in Portland, Oregon went to Minidoka, Idaho, and all their family and friends went to Minidoka. My father and our family, our immediate family, went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And he was told that the reason why he was being sent to Heart Mountain was because they needed registered pharmacists there. When they got to Heart Mountain, there were many registered pharmacists already there. And my father ended up working as a carpenter there. And they found out later that the reason why our family was separated was because there were some Japanese Americans, Niseis, who were blaming other Japanese Americans, such as people who were from the JACL, because they felt that they were maybe almost being a traitor to the cause of the freedom of the Japanese Americans. They accused people, such as my father, of turning in or naming people who may be questionable, and some of those people were maybe sent to Tule Lake. And so then the other Japanese Americans would beat up on the JACL people. So supposedly we were sent to Heart Mountain to protect our family from other Japanese Americans, which was really kind of ironic. And my mother said that she had written some things years later. One time when we were in the barracks, she was in the barracks by herself. Someone threw in a note or pasted up a note and called my father Howard DeWitt, who was he was more or less the head of the internment, the whole internment effort on the side of the government. So in other words, they were labeling my father as part of that. And I think that another time something was tossed through the window, a burning newspaper, and my mother had to stamp it out, and she wrote down, she didn't know how she stamped it out by herself, but it was those kinds of terrorist things that happened to her that made my mother very bitter about the whole experience, and she never spoke about it. In fact, years later, if anyone even mentioned something, it just kind of got my mother all riled up about it. And it was because not just of the experience itself, but because of all the other memories and difficulties that they had from both sides.
So I was here from 4th grade and all the way through the University of Minnesota.
What did your father do here?
He went to work first at the Curtis Hotel, which used to be one of the big downtown hotels, and he worked in their kitchen. But he really struggled with that job because his English was just not that good. In Seattle he could get by because we were in this Japanese community. But here it was just a struggle for him. And so he ended up being sort of like doing a janitor's job at St. Mary's Hospital, which is now Fairview University Hospital. Anyway, it's down over there off of Riverside Avenue.
I should tell you about my dad. He went back to Japan in 1951 during the Korean War, and my brother was in the army in Japan at that time, so he saw my dad, and he went out to visit the family. My brother said that he was so depressed and he was not feeling well. He went to the doctor over there, feeling depressed, and when he was coming back on the ship, he jumped overboard. He committed suicide, and I consider him a casualty of the war.
So what do you think contributed?
Well, I think after he saw what his family went through, he was terribly depressed by that. And then in the situation here in Minneapolis, I think that he felt that he was already in his 60s and couldn't get a job. He felt as if he wasn't contributing anything to the family, and I think that we kind of took him for granted. Years later, I've always felt guilty because I think that we could have done more to make him feel more comfortable. He couldn't accept his role. I think that we could have done more to help him feel better about himself.
In spite of all the difficulties and, the hardships that the people endured, for many people it was kind of a blessing in disguise, and for us it was kind of that way because it helped us to disperse a little bit, quite a bit more. And so in our case of coming to Minnesota, we were able to have more opportunities because there were fewer Japanese Americans at that point. And so even though there were still barriers and there were still hardships, we did succeed, and my father was able to do well as a pharmacist and a buyer for Gray's drugstore. My mother, had both Japanese and Caucasian friends, and it was almost like when you have a lot of people who are living closely together and you're so distinguishable because of your nationality. It was a difficult thing right after World War II even. But for us, it certainly allowed us to spread our wings a little bit more and do well.
We found that most Minnesotans were very cordial, and they didn't show any kind of prejudice outside of housing.
Yes, actually, when we first moved into this house that we lived on in South Minneapolis, we were the only Japanese family for several miles around, I'm sure.
In 1954, we decided to move out to Roseville. And at that time, there were a lot of returning GIs, and they were new little homes, and we were all set to close. And the guy said, I don't know, I better talk to the rest of these people that are buying in this neighborhood. I better see what's all right with them.
And we thought, oh, they have these inexpensive tract homes in Bloomington. So we went to Orrin Thompson Home, and every time we went to a model home, they ignored us. And finally they came out and said, we are not going to sell to you.
It was just a matter of days when we started getting hate mail, saying, we don't want any Japs in the neighborhood, get out or else.
Edina was strictly no.
No agents wanted there?
No, they didn't allow it.
So we had the JCL, where they were going to try to do something that we could purchase a home.
My brother, he put earnest money down on a house on 57th and Newton South. And the neighborhood got all bent out of shape. Reporters went out. No one would talk to them. And the fellow that was trying to sell the house, he says, gee, I knew my neighbors, and I'm sorry, I'll have to give you your money back,
But in the meantime, my sister had a friend who lived in this project. They're all tract homes. And she said, oh, someone is selling their home in Bloomington. And so she says, I bet you could buy that house. And then Orrin Thompson has nothing to say about it if an owner sells it. And so we thought it would be a good investment, that we were going to live there 5 years. After 6, 7 years, then we had children, and we're still there. It's 54 years, and we're still living there.